He walked into that courtroom like a king returning to his castle. Badge glinting under the harsh lights, chin high, smirk carved deep. He thought that shiny badge made him untouchable, that no one would dare question his authority. But then she raised her head, and in her eyes, there was something he didn't expect. A calm, unwavering fire that cut deeper than any cross-examination. He thought dragging her here would be the end of her. But it was the beginning of something he couldn't control. Subscribe to Endless Stories and share this video. Because sometimes, the real power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from the voice that refuses to be silenced. The courthouse was a cold monolith of stone and glass, its halls echoing with footsteps that never seemed to end. Morning light poured through the high windows, slicing the air into neat, sterile beams. Outside, the city hummed with life. Horns blaring, voices rising, people moving on. But inside this room, the world was frozen, waiting for something to break. At the defendant's table sat a woman, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hands folded in her lap. Her face was calm, almost too calm, as if she had already decided that nothing here could touch her. She wore a navy blazer, the collar pressed so sharply it could cut paper. But it wasn't her clothes that caught the room's attention. It was her eyes, dark, steady, and unflinching. He sat across from her, the man who thought his badge was a crown. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform tailored to perfection. The gold shield on his chest glinted under the overhead lights, catching every flicker of movement. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly on the polished wood table. There was a smirk on his lips, the kind that comes from knowing the world will move for you if you push it hard enough. He scanned the room with practiced ease. The judge, the jury, the spectators, they were all part of his stage. They'd seen that badge and they'd believe it meant something. He'd made sure of that year after year, arrest after arrest. But as he looked at the woman across from him, something shifted. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. And that alone was enough to unsettle him. Just a little. Outside the courtroom windows, the city was bright and loud. Inside, the air was heavy, as if every breath had to be earned. The bailiff called the room to order, his voice a sharp echo off the marble walls. The judge entered, robes billowing behind him, and the room rose as one. Then they sat, the hush that followed as sudden and complete as a slammed door. The judge's gavel was a dull thud on the bench. "State your case," he said, his voice low and measured. The prosecutor stood, a man in a crisp suit, his hair combed back with meticulous care. He began to speak, words rolling out smooth and confident. But in the back of the room, an old man shifted in his seat, watching with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed. The badge didn't move. His smirk didn't falter. But his fingers drummed faster, a soft patter that only he seemed to hear. He was used to rooms like this, rooms where he was the hero, the shield on his chest enough to silence any doubt. But today the air felt different. Today, the woman in the navy blazer didn't look like she was here to be silenced. She sat still, hands folded, eyes never leaving his. Every word the prosecutor said seemed to pass over her like rain over stone. She was listening, but she wasn't moved. And he realized, too late perhaps, that she was the kind of woman who didn't break under pressure. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. In the back of the room, the old man watched her too. He saw something in her that he recognized, a quiet strength that didn't need to be shouted to be real. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, in the eyes of soldiers and mothers and men who had nothing left to lose. The badge shifted in his seat, his smile tightening. He thought this would be easy. He thought his badge was enough. But as the woman sat there, silent and unmoving, he began to wonder if he had misjudged. And for the first time that morning, the badge felt the weight of the room pressing back against him. The judge's voice cut through the quiet. "Proceed," he said, and the prosecutor did. But all the badge could see was her. All he could hear was the silent promise in her eyes. "I will not be broken." And for a moment, just a moment, his badge didn't feel so heavy. Felt like a burden he couldn't shake. The city outside kept moving, bright and busy. as if it didn't know the battle brewing in that courtroom. But inside, under the harsh white lights, a man who thought he was untouchable faced a woman who refused to be anything but heard. And that was the beginning of the end, though he didn't know it yet. The silence of the courtroom was a living thing, breathing, waiting. He leaned back in his chair, the badge on his chest catching the dull glow of the overhead lights. The woman across from him didn't move, didn't blink. She sat there like a statue, but her eyes burned with something that made the air crackle. The prosecutor's words kept flowing, a river of practiced phrases and carefully chosen pauses. But the badge's mind was somewhere else. He couldn't stop watching her, the way her jaw tightened just a fraction with every lie he thought he could get away with. He shifted in his seat, trying to regain the easy calm that usually came so naturally to him. But it wasn't there. Instead, every word felt heavy. Every glance from the jury a question he didn't have an answer to. The woman spoke only once, her voice low but clear. "I have nothing to hide," she said. And it was like a hammer blow in the room, simple, direct, final. For a moment, he almost respected her. Almost. But respect wasn't in his nature. He was a man who believed in power, the kind you could see, the kind that came with a badge and a gun. So he let his smirk slip back onto his face, like a mask he'd worn 1,000 times. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with the threat beneath. "You think they're going to believe you over me?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because in the quiet of that courtroom, her silence said more than any shout could. The bailiff shifted near the door, the only sound the faint squeak of his shoes on the polished floor. The judge watched from behind his bench, eyes unreadable, hands folded like a man waiting for something he knew was coming. The badge could feel the weight of every eye on him. He'd never minded it before. He liked being the center of attention. But today it felt different. It felt like every stare was a crack in the armor he'd spent years building. She was the reason why. In the back of his mind, memories he'd worked hard to bury began to stir. Nights in the city when the sirens sang him to sleep. Faces he'd turned away from because it was easier. The woman's face in front of him was different. It was a mirror, and it showed him everything he didn't want to see. He tried to laugh it off. "I'm just doing my job," he said. But the words sounded hollow in the air. "You think that makes you right?" she said quietly. The words cut deeper than he expected. He looked at her, really looked, and saw that she wasn't just here to save herself. She was here because someone had to stand up, even if it was just her. The jury shifted in their seats, whispers like a breeze rustling dry leaves. The badge's fingers drummed against the table again, faster now, as if he could drown out the sound of his own doubt. The judge cleared his throat. "Let's proceed," he said. But the badge wasn't listening anymore. He was trapped in the quiet fury of the woman's gaze, in the slow, steady realization that his badge wasn't enough to protect him from the truth. Outside, the world kept moving, the city's noise a distant echo. But inside the courtroom, time stretched thin, a tightrope of words and glances and the heavy weight of what was left unsaid. The badge shifted again, his smile slipping. He thought he could break her. He thought the badge on his chest made him safe. But now he wasn't so sure. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't need to, because she knew, and now he did too, that sometimes the only thing that matters isn't the badge you wear. It's the truth you're willing to face. And as the judge called the next witness, the badge realized he was no longer the hunter in this room. He was the hunted. The witness took the stand. A man in a worn suit, eyes darting between the badge and the woman. His hands twisted around each other, the knuckles pale and tight. The prosecutor's questions came fast, each word a soft push, a careful prod at the edges of what this man was willing to say. For a moment, the badge let himself believe this was his moment to regain control. He leaned forward, his eyes hard, the faintest smile creeping back onto his lips. But the woman across the room never shifted. She watched the witness, her expression calm, her posture straight, and somehow, that stillness made her the center of everything. The witness spoke slowly, each sentence a quiet confession. He told of what he saw, not everything, but enough. Enough to let the jury see the cracks in the badge's story. The lines of doubt that had started to grow the moment she walked into the courtroom. The badge clenched his jaw, fingers curling into fists against the table. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, each one like a hand pulling at the seams of his uniform. The woman still didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any accusation. He thought of the nights he'd spent patrolling the city, the darkness a comfort, the badge a shield. He thought of the faces he'd turned away from, the voices he'd learned to ignore. All of it came rushing back now, sharp and clear as glass. And in the stillness of that courtroom, he felt the edges of every lie he'd ever told cutting into him. The judge watched with careful eyes, his fingers steepled under his chin. The prosecutor moved closer to the witness, voice dropping to a low murmur, the questions pulling at threads the badge thought he'd hidden for good. He wanted to shout, to stand up and remind them all who he was. But he didn't, because he knew. Deep down, he knew. The woman's eyes met his, steady and calm. She didn't flinch when the witness spoke, didn't look away when the details of his past came out in hushed tones and careful words. Her gaze held him there, pinned him to the truth he couldn't run from anymore. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars honked, sirens wailed. Life carried on. But in that room, time stopped. And for the first time, he felt what it was to be truly seen. Not as a badge, not as a uniform, but as a man with everything to lose. The witness finished speaking, his voice trailing off into the heavy silence. The prosecutor stepped back, nodding once, and the judge turned to the badge. "Do you have anything to add?" he asked. The badge opened his mouth, but no words came. The courtroom seemed to close in around him, the walls too close, the air too thin. He looked at her, at the woman he'd tried to break, and saw in her eyes the weight of every secret he'd hoped would stay buried. She didn't speak. She didn't have to, because in that silence, she said everything. The judge cleared his throat. "We'll take a brief recess," he said, his gavel a dull echo in the stillness. The badge stayed in his seat as the others rose, the quiet chatter of the room washing over him like static. She stood too, gathering her papers with careful precision, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She didn't look at him again, but he felt her presence as sharply as if she had. As the room emptied, he sat there alone, his badge suddenly feeling like a weight he couldn't bear. The silence pressed in, louder than any accusation, more damning than any word. And in that silence, he knew. The woman he'd tried to crush was the one voice he couldn't silence. The courtroom filled again after the recess, the low murmur of voices dying quickly as the judge returned to his bench. The woman stood at her table, calm as ever, while the badge shifted in his seat, his shoulders tense beneath the dark fabric of his uniform. He could feel sweat on his brow, though the air was cool, and the polished wood of the table beneath his fingers felt slick. The prosecutor rose, his voice measured and firm. "Your Honor," he said, "we'd like to recall the woman to the stand." The judge nodded, and she stepped forward, each movement steady, every step measured. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, a sound that cut through the quiet like a warning. She took the oath without hesitation, her hand steady as she raised it. Then she sat, folding her hands in her lap, her back straight. The prosecutor began slowly, his questions gentle, as if he knew he was treading close to something fragile but unbreakable. "Tell us," he said. "Who was he to you?" His voice was soft, but it carried in the hush of the room. For a moment she didn't answer. She looked at the badge, and he felt the weight of that gaze as if it pressed a hand to his chest. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear. "He was someone who thought his badge made him bigger than the truth," she said. The words fell into the room like stones in still water, sending ripples that no one could ignore. The badge shifted, his jaw working. He wanted to protest, to shout her down, but something in her eyes held him back. It was a look he'd never seen before. Not fear, not anger, but something deeper, a certainty that couldn't be shaken. "And did he ever tell you his real name?" the prosecutor asked. She nodded once. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but somehow louder than anything else. He told me the name he thought no one else knew. The name he used when he didn't want to be a badge anymore. A hush fell over the room, so complete that even the judge leaned forward. The badge felt his stomach twist, the room spinning around that one word. Name. He had shared it once, long ago. In a moment of weakness he'd never let himself remember. And now she was about to speak it aloud. She turned to the judge, her voice steady as she said it. Your Honor, the name he used was John Michael Hayes. The badge flinched. No one else in the room understood what that name meant. But he did. It was the name he'd given to the man he was before the badge. The man who had dreams and fears and a heart that could still be broken. It was the name he thought he'd buried. The judge looked at him, the weight of that name settling in the room like a verdict before the gavel fell. The jury shifted in their seats, the prosecutor watching with a gaze as sharp as a blade. The badge sat there, his mouth dry, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling like a brand. He wanted to deny it, to tell them it was nothing. But the way she said it, so calm, so sure, left no room for doubt. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe we've heard enough. The truth is in her words, and the truth is in that name. The judge nodded slowly, his face grave. Very well, he said, his voice soft. We'll let the truth stand. The woman stepped down from the stand, her movements as steady as when she had walked in. She didn't look at the badge again, but he felt her presence, as real as the uniform he wore. As the jury filed out to deliberate, he sat there, his badge heavy on his chest, the name she had spoken echoing in his mind. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was to be stripped bare. No badge, no authority, just a man with nothing left to hide behind. Outside the courtroom, the city kept moving, cars honking, people shouting, life going on. But inside, he sat in the quiet that followed her words, the truth hanging in the air like a flag of surrender. And he realized, in that moment, she hadn't just spoken his name. She had spoken the end of the lie he'd lived behind for far too long. The jury's deliberation took hours. Outside, the sun had shifted, streaks of gold cutting across the sky as afternoon slipped into dusk. Inside the courtroom, the badge sat in silence, his shoulders slumped, the gleam of his uniform dulled by sweat and shame. He didn't look at anyone. Not the woman, not the prosecutor, not even the judge. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty witness stand, as if he could still see her there, her quiet strength ringing louder than any gavel. She sat in the back row now, away from the spotlight, papers clutched in her hands. She wasn't watching him. Her gaze was turned out the window, where the last light of day glowed against the glass. Her expression was calm, almost tender, as if she knew the hardest part was over. The room was quieter now. No more whispers, no more rustle of papers. Just the slow tick of the courtroom clock and the hush that always comes before a verdict. The bailiff opened the door, his face solemn. They're ready, he said, his voice soft but certain. The judge nodded, and the jury filed in, eyes down, hands folded in front of them. The badge felt his pulse in his throat, every beat a reminder of how much he'd built his life on the weight of that shield, and how easily it could slip from his grasp. The foreman stood, a paper in his hands. His voice was steady, measured. We find the defendant guilty, he said. The words were simple, but they fell like iron. The badge didn't move. He felt them settle in his chest, heavy and final. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no gasp, no cry, just the quiet intake of breath from those who had waited so long to see what justice would look like today. The judge's voice was low. Sentence will be delivered tomorrow, he said. Then he banged the gavel, and just like that, it was done. The badge let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the verdict. He didn't watch the courtroom empty. He stayed there, staring at his hands. The fingers that had once held power now curled into fists he didn't know what to do with. The woman didn't leave immediately. She gathered her things carefully, pausing only once to look at him. It wasn't a look of triumph. Not the smirk he had worn so many times. It was something closer to sadness or maybe understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of the burden that comes when the truth finally has its say. When she passed by him, she didn't speak. She didn't need to, but she paused, just for a breath, and in that breath was a moment of grace. A silent offering that said, "This isn't about winning. This is about seeing." About refusing to let the weight of silence crush what was always there. As the last light of day faded outside, she walked away, her footsteps soft and even. The badge watched her go, something breaking open in his chest that he didn't have words for. Outside the courtroom, the world was waiting. The city lights flickering to life, the hum of traffic, the murmur of people who would never know what happened here today. But for him, everything had changed. He rose slowly, the uniform still on his shoulders but no longer a shield. For the first time, he felt the truth of what it meant to be seen without the armor he'd worn for so long. In the quiet that followed, he realized that justice didn't belong to the badge. It belonged to the people willing to speak when everyone else stayed silent. He turned to the window, the last streaks of sunlight catching in the glass. In the reflection, he didn't see the badge anymore. He saw the man he used to be, and the man he might still become. And in that fragile, fleeting moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Gratitude. Gratitude for the woman who hadn't let his power crush her voice. Gratitude for the truth that had finally broken through. Gratitude for the silence that said everything words never could. The sun had vanished by the time he stepped outside. The courthouse behind him a fortress of stone that seemed to hold all the day's echoes. The air was cooler now, carrying the hush of a city settling into night. He paused on the steps, the badge on his chest catching the glow of the streetlights, but it felt different now. Not a symbol of power, but a reminder of what it cost to wear it. He could hear the city's heartbeat around him, the rumble of buses, the low murmur of voices, the clatter of footsteps on cracked pavement. Life went on, indifferent to what had passed in that courtroom. But for him, the world had shifted. Every sound felt sharper, every breath a little deeper, as if the weight of the truth had made everything else clearer. He thought about the woman, how she had sat so still, how her voice had cut through the noise without ever needing to rise. He thought about how she had looked at him in the end, not with triumph or scorn, but with a quiet finality. He wondered if he would ever understand what that meant, if he could ever learn how to carry the truth the way she had. She was gone now, disappeared into the flow of the evening crowd. But her presence lingered, a quiet echo in his mind. It reminded him that some truths don't need to be shouted to be heard, that sometimes the loudest thing in the room is the silence of someone who refuses to back down. He walked slowly, the city unfolding around him in waves of neon and headlights. Every step felt different, heavier, but somehow more real. He passed people who didn't know his name, who didn't know the story he was carrying. And he felt something close to relief in that anonymity. The badge had been his identity for so long, but tonight, it was just a piece of metal against his chest. When he reached the corner, he stopped. A diner's window glowed warm and yellow, the laughter inside soft and human. He stood there for a moment, watching the easy familiarity of people who had no idea who he was. For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his own breath, and the quiet it left behind. He turned away from the window and kept walking, his footsteps slow and even. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't need to. The night was full of paths he'd never seen, and for once, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. Behind him, the courthouse loomed, its doors closed and its echoes fading. But in his mind, the woman's voice remained, soft but certain, like the final note of a song that didn't need to end in applause. He paused under a street lamp, the glow painting him in soft gold. He took off the badge, turning it over in his hand, the metal cool against his skin. In that moment, he realized that the badge had never made him untouchable. It had only made him forget how to be human. He slipped it into his pocket, his hand closing around it. Not to hide it, but to carry it differently. To remember that silence can be a kind of strength, and that sometimes the quietest voices leave the deepest marks. As he walked away from the courthouse, the city swallowed him up. his figure a shadow among countless others. No headlines would mark this night, no speeches or parades. But somewhere in the hush between streetlights and whispers, he found a kind of peace. Not in the badge, not in the verdict, but in the simple act of listening, and in the knowledge that the woman's silence had spoken louder than any badge ever could. And in that final quiet, he understood. There are some truths you can't outrun. There are some silences that echo forever. Thank you for watching. If the story moved you, if it made you pause and see the quiet strength in silence, please subscribe to Endless Stories. Like and share this video. Let these stories reach those who need to hear them. Because in a world full of noise, sometimes the only voice that matters is the one that refuses to be silenced.